Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again on my Fireside Divination Chats, still in our rune study series. We are going to deviate from our sociology lectures and get into what we really want to study this time, and that is the actual runes itself. Woo! And so we are going to start with the first letter of the alphabet, and that is Fehu, which is the Rune of Wealth. If you don't have a rune set already, that's okay. There's plenty of ways to procure one. I do encourage you to make your own. If not, buying one is fine, but that's a topic for a later time. This is Fehu. This is from my personal rune set. This is the bag here. I think I had that one in last episode. I spun this bag by hand and knit it by hand. And this set I actually made by hand out of polymer clay. So it doesn't have to be fancy, okay? It doesn't have to be made out of stone. It doesn't have to be made out of bone. You can even put them on paper, all right? But I do want to get that out of the way. So this is Fehu. Fehu is the Rune of Wealth, and it translates into cattle, and then from there it translates into wealth. So very strange, very odd to the uninitiated and to the unaware. If you have a background in linguistics and in history, this is not going to be very odd at you at all. Or maybe you don't have an understanding of history and linguistics. Maybe you're like me and you grew up in an agrarian society and happened to just have cattle on the farm and just knew that that's just where your wealth was tied to, was cattle. So, let's get to it and dive into it, and we'll understand how this strange animal became to symbolize wealth. So the first place we're going to start with is the boring stuff, and that's going to be our linguistics, and that's going to be the etymology, all right? Today is just water. I will have links in the description below. This is just pulled from the Wikipedia page because I like Wikipedia. It's a really good, free to access, and honestly reputable academic source. A lot of people say it's not peer reviewed. I disagree. Just because the people who are reviewing it don't have credentials doesn't necessarily mean it's not credible. That's just elitism coming out. So anyways, according to the Wikipedia article of cattle, cattle did not originate as the term for bovine animals. It was borrowed from Anglo-Norman catel, itself from medieval Latin capital, principal sum of money, capital. Itself derived in turn from Latin caput, head. Cattle originally meant movable personal property, especially livestock of any kind, as opposed to real property, meaning land, which was also included wild or small free roaming animals such as chickens. They were sold as part of the land. The word is a variant of chattel, a unit of personal property, and closely related to capital in the economic sense. The term replaced earlier Old English feoh, that's F-E-O-H, for those playing along at home, cattle, property, which survives today as fee, German ve, Dutch v, Gothic fehu, which is F-A-I-H-U. And Fehu, which is what we are studying, is F-E-H-U. That is the English spelling of this. And it ran off because that's what these little bastards do. Actually, it didn't run off. I probably put it back in here. Whatever. That is the English spelling of that letter. So that's actually really, really important, having understood why that is. So historically, in an agrarian society, cattle was where your wealth was tied up in. Not necessarily just in your grain or in your chickens or in your sheep or what have you. Cattle was considered to be the absolute king of all livestock. Not only because of the land and the resources it took to grow it, but also because of the labor it took to maintain it. It wasn't enough to just have one field to raise cattle. You have to rotate your fields. I think you need at least 3 to 4 fields to transfer your livestock through if you do grass-fed or even grain-fed cattle. My family did dairy farming, so we didn't really have to have that many pastures because we could just feed them, we could just feed them feed and go for it. Now that farm did get taken and stolen by the nice land grab of the 1960s from 1980s. Thank you, Reagan. And I will take every cheap shot at Reagan I can because of that bastard. We're still still feeling the effects of what he did economically. And we'll probably get a little more into how economics apply to Fehu as we get on. So I do encourage you to read up on the Wikipedia article if you don't know much about agriculture, or specifically cattle agriculture, bovine agriculture, because it's very fascinating, it's very interesting. And a lot of it is actually going to, apply here. So if you don't know, cattle was actually one of the first animals domesticated. It was domesticated approximately 10,500 years ago, about the early Neolithic age. So that's very early in human prehistory. There were two places where cows were domesticated, first in Africa and first in the Middle East. It was also used as a form of money. So that's really interesting as well. So about 9,000 BC, we're talking years ago, grain and cattle were used as money or as barter. And I find that interesting that Fehu looks like a sheaf of wheat. It always gets me confused because I'm like, in my mind, it means cattle, but it looks like wheat. And it's interesting that grain and cattle were before paper currency used as forms of currency. And you could measure your wealth in the amount of grain and the amount of cattle that you had, because that was a way of your life being profitable. We'll get into it in the next rune, Urus, but these guys were domesticated from wild aurochs, and that's very important. And you'll find that as you start getting into heathenry, cows are very sacred. A lot of people immediately go to dairy, but they do produce a lot of meat. They also produce hide. So hide, sinew, meat, bone, antler, horn rather, which is slightly different from antler. And there's a lot of products you can get from the dairy. That would be your cream, yogurt. I don't know if they did yogurt. Skyr, I think, would be the Icelandic version. But they had some kind of fermented dairy in Scandinavia, of course. Cheese, of course, another fermented type of dairy. And very important as well, way of preserving it. Cheese, dairy, yogurt, cream. And that in and of itself, the milk was very important, because you have to understand, it was kind of like the superfood of its day. One of the interesting things about Europeans is that milk very closely is very closely tied to our evolution, particularly because we didn't get a lot of sunshine in those areas. There are times of limited sunshine. So vitamin D deficiency causes rickets. Now, milk is fortified with vitamin D, but it still has a really high level of vitamin D in and of itself. It's also really, really nutrient dense and really dense in calories as well. It really was a staple of the diet, as was meat, if you could get it. Grain when it was in season, especially bread. That's just the stuff that the actual cow itself could produce. Cows, we forget about cattle being beasts of burden. We also forget in Western society about oxen. These are trained animals that can produce labor. Now, they're not as fast moving as horses, but they do have a lot more horsepower than horses. So they would move millstones, they would move large, merchant loads. You could, and in fact, ride them depending on what you were doing and where you were going. But they would be pulling large, heavy loads that horses could not do over sustained long distances. They were more reliable for pulling a plow in a way that a horse simply just could not. there's a lot of things that cows could do that made them superior to horses as far as livestock, and there's a simple reason why wealth was tied to your cattle and just in general. Um, so, I won't bore you with the culture of cattle, but I do come from the Scotch, good strong Scotch, descended from Clan MacGregor, particularly Rob Roy. I did go through my documentation and did find that. That's really interesting. And we were cattle thieves. There's actually a running joke between the Wallace clan and the MacGregor clan about having stolen each other's cows, so much so that if you go to the Highland Games, MacGregors will actually bring little like knick-knack cows to Clan Wallace as a way of like, sorry for taking your cows. It's like a symbolic gesture. It's all fun and games now, but I'm sure it caused a lot of wars back then. Probably it did. We're going to go over the rune poems. So if you don't have those printed out, link to my blog post is down below. You will find the pertinent excerpts to the Old Norse, Icelandic, and the Anglo-Saxon, which we'll be focusing on, will be excerpted out for you so you can pull it up in another tab and follow along if you wish. So starting with the Old Norse rune poem. Wealth is the source of discord among kinsmen. The wolf lives in the forest. In the Icelandic, source of discord among kinsmen, and fire of the sea, and path of the serpent. And this one here, I'm going to the Anglo-Saxon Narrative Poetry Project, also linked down below. I just prefer this translation because I think it's very pretty and I like how contemporary it is. Wealth is a comfort to every man, although every man must share it out greatly if he would obtain a portion of the Lord's glory. So right off the bat, we've already got 2 warnings and a solution to a very human problem. But before we go a little deeper into that, I do want to point out some linguistics here. Kinsman is a very archaic English word. Many individuals do not understand exactly what kinsman means. They think it means family, and it's true. It does have family associated with it. But kin is more akin to clan, and that's clan with a C, not clan with a K. Thank you, you bastards. That's why I wear this shirt here, because a lot of my traditions have been hijacked by supremacists, and that's just simply one of them. So, I digress. Clan is simply another way of saying tribe, okay? And so a very modern way of understanding kinsmen would be tribesmen. Also would be a way of understanding countrymen. That would be another way of understanding it as well. Makes it a little easy to understand there. So, but it does have a closer connection. Like you do share common ancestors, you do share common ground. So there's that to consider as well. Now, my favorite of these poems is the Old Norse rune poem, even though I prefer the Anglo-Saxon by and large as far as the poems of study are concerned, because I like the imagery. Wealth is the source of discord among kinsmen. The wolf lives in the forest. And there are some translations that actually swap lives for lurks that I've seen. That's really ominous. And if you look at the Icelandic, source of discord among kinsmen, and if you swap out kinsmen for family, or swap it out for countrymen or fellow citizen, that doesn't get much better either, all right? And fire of the sea, like Greek fire, I mean, these were master shipbuilders. These were master rivermen. I have no doubt in my mind that they came in contact with the Aegean Sea. Fire of the sea? Oh, crap. Greek fire. And Path of the Serpent. I always think of Jormungandr when I think of that. I don't know why. There's a lot of imagery in here, none of which is very pleasant. Wow, holy snaps. And then the Anglo-Saxon, wealth is a comfort to every man, although every man must share it out greatly if he would obtain a portion of the Lord's glory. It's important to understand that the Anglo-Saxon is the most modern of these poems. Iceland was actually the last country of the Scandinavian countries to convert, and the European for that matter, to convert to Christianity. So a lot of Nordic traditions actually survived much more intact. But since this one is the most modern of them, and the Normans were the more recent, the first to really convert to Christianity, you're going to find a lot of Christian symbology and iconography in their resources. That doesn't necessarily mean that these resources are, less valuable or that they have no meaning and that they're trash. It just means that we get to tweak, as it were, their meanings and have a little bit of an understanding of what they're doing. So, every man must share it out greatly if he would obtain a portion of the Lord's glory. So, contemporarily speaking, the Norse traditions had to go underground at this time. So I'm going to go with that's going to be divine. So I'm going to apply a modern understanding of this to it and go with divine. So there's a flat out warning in this. Yes, it is comfortable to have it. Everyone wants it, and you must share it. Because these other two poems right here are flat out warning you they will kill you for it. All right? Because cattle is wealth that has to be maintained. Cattle will get up and leave you if they're not happy. They can get sick and die if you don't maintain them. You have to feed them. You have to water them. You have to milk them if they are dairy. You have to cull the herd come winter. So during winter, you have to, some of them are sacrificed to the gods, and the meat is used to feed, and some preserved until spring. But you can't keep your entire herd over winter. You just don't have those resources. You don't. And that's why it's a symbiotic relationship. Give and take on a macro level, not necessarily on a micro level. And it's a very sacred relationship, in my opinion, because of the nature of what you're relying on for each other, livelihood wise and survival aspect. So, but I really go back to the Old Norse poem because the wolf lives in the forest. That is a very predatorial image right there. The wolf lurks in the forest, as I read in some translations. Wow, like flat out warning. And then the Anglo-Saxon just tells you, like, just don't even. Just give it out. Absolutely. And good karma will come to you. It will gain you favor in the divine eye. It's the mark of an honorable man. It's a good thing to do. Lots of things. So that's going to be our ancient understanding of Fehu. How the hell does that apply to our modern understanding? Well, I'm glad you asked, or at least you should be asking that question. So if you were to go into a modern grocery store today and look at the meat section, you would see that beef is still one of the most expensive meats you can buy. In fact, according to Wikipedia, the beef cattle industry is a $30 billion industry worldwide. 30 billion with a B. So there's a lot of money tied up in cattle worldwide, and it's one of the largest industries in the world, agriculture-wise. I didn't do any more research on how that stacks up against grain or other agricultural products, but I did find it interesting that it's 30 billion because I wasn't expecting that kind of money at all. I didn't even look at the dairy numbers, just beef. So, wow. So that alone gives you an idea of just how profitable it is just to even have these animals, much less consume them. Because we understand that cattle was earned wealth back in the day because it requires so much resource and labor to maintain. In today's society, also understanding the etymology that that capital is actually descended from cattle and fee is descended from Fehu, that is going to be literally our career, our investments, and our financial capital assets. Okay, so when it comes up in a reading, that is how we're going to apply it. Okay, Fehu in spell work is going to be good for earned wealth. So it's not a spell work I'm going to use for a manifestation spell and expect money to come my way, but it is a good rune to use in the spell work if I'm asking my boss for a raise, if I'm looking for job interviews, if I'm looking for a good, if I'm looking for more better economic opportunities. But do expect to work your ass off, because nothing in Heatherine comes for free. That's just the name of the game. One of the interesting things I really find about cattle or about Fehu is how it applies to our modern society, particularly with the Anglo-Saxon poems and the Old Norse poems. The wolf lurks in the forest, wealth is a discord amongst kinsmen. When you hoard your wealth, you will create discord. If you give it out freely, you will gain favor. So historically, you would have had a feudalist system where the Jarl, the Earl, would have taken care of his serfs and vassals economically and also militaristically, and defended them. So were you a good Jarl and you took care of your lovely, wonderful serfs and vassals, or did you tax them into obliteration and they ended up murdering you in the middle of the night and replacing you with a successor? In the 21st century, we have modern billionaires, and they're not just modern billionaires, they're multi-billionaires with a B, and they're multinational billionaires. These would be people such as George Soros, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, J.K. Rowling. So when you start looking at Fehu and you start applying the meanings of the rune poems, are you using your wealth for good, or are you using it for evil? Because it is very clearly laid out. There are consequences for how you apply your wealth. So Bill Gates actually has charitable foundations set up for applying creating opportunities for higher education for disadvantaged youth. J.K. Rowling lost her billionaire status for charitable giving and is known for her Lumos Foundation. Jeff Bezos, on the other hand, is starting to wade into the line of human rights violations and labor rights violations because Amazon is so big. The Walton family is famous for exploiting government social program as a means of supplementing the wages they give their employees rather than coming up with their own benefits package. So, what are you doing? As far as that discord amongst kinsmen, we see it echoed in the Fight for 15. We see it in the Occupy Wall Street. We are seeing it in Andrew Yang's Universal Basic Income. UBI, I think is what he's calling it. We're seeing it in automation, labor. We're seeing it in the upper echelons of society as they exploit the lowers. We do see it historically. We would see these same theories echoed in what we call in American history the Gilded Age. In European history, we call it the Industrial Revolution, or in Victorian England. So that would be your Triangle Fire. That would be American. That would be the Russian Revolution. I forgot what the labor reform movement in England was called, because again, I'm not an English history scholar. I'm an American history scholar. So think about how modern billionaires affect society, how they apply and control to society, and how Fehu applies to that. How Fehu applies to our careers, how our investments, and how we have to maintain and work at them. This is not wealth that just lands in our laps. And it could very well be inherited wealth. Remember, farmland, assets are definitely handed down family to family, frith and grith, of course, if you're familiar with those terms. Another really fun way to think of Fehu, if you're not wanting to think of modern politics, would be Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark. These are billionaires in their own universes. Do they use their wealth for good, or do they use it for evil? How are they applying their influence? Because in my mind, Batman's superpower isn't the fact that he's any particular talent, it's that he has access to unlimited resources in a society where want and need are very common. Tony Stark, on the other hand, is a super genius with unlimited access to whatever the hell, you know. So, literature-wise, there is a book, I'll link the Amazon down below. I wrote it when, I read it when I was in this 8th grade. It's called A Day No Pigs Would Die by Robert Newton Peck. It is a sad book. Just read the synopsis if you want online. It is about how livestock have a place and a use in society, especially in a society where pets just simply cannot exist. Everything has a place and has a use. It is sad. You will cry your eyes out. I do trigger warning there. It's very emotional. But it is a really good book for examining how society has its role for livestock and how agriculture goes into there. But outside of that, I really hope I've given you an idea of how Fehu can be used, how its meaning is applied, at least, unraveled some of the mystery behind this, how it can be used in spell work, how it can be read in divination. A lot of it is going to be, of course, contextual. So outside of that, please comment, like, subscribe. Please ask me your questions. This is why I'm here. 100%. I learn more from your questions than I do from doing my research and reading alone. All right. Also, blog post is down below as well. Definitely click down there. Ask your questions there as well. Quote me, read me, do whatever. Also, if you don't want to watch the video all the way through, guess what? Quick and dirty notes is there as well. So, as always, thank you for joining me. I'm still on the Dom, and y'all have a good evening. Bye.